The conclave of linked minds had existed for 600 years without a single unresolved crisis. Until now, the station they called Vera Solemn, which translated loosely as the place where all currents meet, hung in the gravitational null point between three solar systems, a deliberate architectural statement about neutrality. Every species in the galactic assembly had contributed something to its construction. The Davari had grown its organic hull from engineered coral bone. The Threnish had woven the communication lattice from crystallized thought signal. The Muvori collective had calculated its orbital position down to the 11,000th decimal. 43 species, 6 centuries, one shared monument to cooperation. And right now, every single system aboard it was dying. Not explosively, not dramatically. That would have been easier to explain to the assembly delegates currently crowded into Emergency Chamber 7, their various breathing apparatuses hissing and clicking, their translators struggling with the emotional register of panic. The station was dying the way a mind dies when it can no longer hold its own thoughts together. Systematically, quietly, in sequence. Chief Systems Analyst Vorth of the 7th Deepening stood at the central diagnostic pillar, her 6th sensory filaments pressed flat against her thorax. The Davari gestured for controlled despair. The pillar projected a cascading map of failures, each node blinking from gold to amber to red in a slow, rhythmic collapse. Power redistribution, degraded. Atmospheric processors, degraded. The deep current channels that allowed the Threnish members to communicate via resonance signal, completely offline. 47 hours. That was how long Vortha's team estimated before the cascade reached the station's core thermal regulators. After that, the temperature differential between Vera Solemn's inner chambers and the vacuum outside would make habitation impossible within 6 hours. 53 hours total. That was what remained of 6 centuries of cooperation. "We have contacted every technical guild in the assembly," said Delegate Mavori Primary. Their body, a dense, slowly rotating sphere of interlocked segments, hovering at the chamber center. Their voice arrived not through sound, but through a subtle vibration in the floor that the translators converted. The precision engineers of Davar have reviewed the cascade diagrams. The resonance architects of Thran have meditated on the signal failure. The calculation sphere of Muvori has run 412,000 simulations. And, said someone near the back, the delegate's segments tightened almost imperceptibly. All simulations end in evacuation. The chamber went very still. Evacuation meant more than losing a station. It meant the collapse of the Conclave's current treaty framework, 17 active accords that required physical presence at Vera Solemn to remain legally binding. It meant 3 border disputes reigniting. It meant that the Ithrani cluster, which had only just agreed to provisional membership in the Assembly, would interpret the abandonment as proof that the older species were unreliable partners. It meant, in ways both symbolic and devastatingly practical, the end of something that could not be rebuilt in any living delegate's lifetime. Vorth studied the cascade map. She had been studying for 31 hours without sleep, which for a Davari meant her secondary neural clusters were beginning to hallucinate faint colors at the edges of her vision. Pink and gold. Her nest mother's colors. She pushed the hallucination aside. The failure was not mechanical. That was the maddening part. Every component was physically intact. The Muvori calculations confirmed it. Nothing was broken in any way that engineering could address. What was broken was a relationship between the systems, the logic by which they communicated their states to each other, the shared language of cause and effect that allowed 43 species' contributions to function as a single coherent whole. Someone had, generations ago, built an assumption into the station's core coordination protocol, a deeply embedded assumption about the nature of sequence, that all processes reported their status in hierarchical order, that higher systems waited for lower systems to confirm stability before proceeding. An elegant assumption, a profoundly reasonable one by the standards of every major civilization in the Assembly. It had worked for 600 years. But 600 years of incremental updates, patches, and additions from 43 different technical traditions had slowly, invisibly accumulated into a situation where the lower systems were now waiting for a confirmation from the higher systems before reporting their own stability. Both layers were waiting for the other to go first. Neither would ever move. The Movori called it a recursive deference loop. Their simulations could model it precisely. They could not model a solution because, by the mathematical framework all assembly civilizations use for systems architecture, a recursive deference loop of this complexity had exactly one resolution: full system shutdown, memory wipe, and rebuild from original parameters, which would take 4 years. Minimum. Vorith pulled her filaments tighter. "There is," said a voice from near the chamber's side entrance, "one option we haven't formally discussed." Every sensory organ in the room oriented toward the speaker. Delegate Neka Osamensa stood with her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral. She was the Assembly's human representative, one of 12 humans currently aboard Vera Solemn, all of them part of the small technical diplomatic contingent that humanity had maintained here for the past 30 years, ever since first contact. She was 44 years old, originally from Accra, and she had spent 2 decades learning to read Davari filament language well enough to notice that Vorith was hallucinating. "The human contingent," Neka said, "would like to formally request access to the station's coordination architecture." The silence that followed had texture. Nobody said no immediately. That was interesting. 30 years ago, they would have. 30 years ago, humans were a curiosity, a young, loud, slightly alarming species that had arrived at the Assembly's borders in a ship held together by, in the Threnish technical assessment, willful optimism and imprecise metallurgy. They had been admitted to provisional observation status after demonstrating sufficient capacity for abstract reasoning and basic diplomacy, and the prevailing Assembly attitude had treated them as clever children, enthusiastic, energetic, occasionally useful for their physical durability in high radiation environments where more refined species required shielding, not technical peers, not architects of complex systems. Helpful, sometimes, in a limited way. But something had shifted in the past decade, quietly and without formal acknowledgement. Small things. A human technician named Marcus Webb had spent 8 months aboard a Threnish deep signal station and had, without being asked, redesigned the ambient sound filtration system using a principle from human acoustic engineering that reduced crew cognitive fatigue by 30%. Nobody had asked him to do it. He had simply noticed a problem and found the experience of not solving it intolerable. A human climatologist named Dr. Sarah Bloom had sat in on a Movori calculation sphere session about atmospheric modeling and had, in the 3rd hour, quietly suggested a different way of framing the baseline variables. The Movori had spent 11 days in offense before running her numbers. They had published a revised model without crediting her, which she had found more amusing than it probably should have amused her. These things accumulated, unspoken, in the Assembly's diplomatic memory. Neka Osamensa waited in the silence she created. Delegate Res Prime, the senior Threnish representative, a tall, angular being whose communication relied on controlled resonance patterns through a secondary throat organ, finally spoke. "The coordination architecture of Vera Solemn represents the combined technical legacy of 43 civilizations. Access requires." "I know what access requires," Neka said. "I've read the protocols. I'm formally requesting an emergency variance under Article 41 of the Assembly Charter, which allows extraordinary technical measures in existential station crises." She paused. "I checked. Nobody has ever invoked it before. That's a remarkable record." Another pause. The record is about to end, one way or another. Vorith watched the exchange from the diagnostic pillar. Her hallucinations had intensified, her nest mother's colors swirling at the room's periphery. But her analytical functions were still sharp enough to notice something that the other delegates might have missed. Neka was not performing confidence. She was performing calm. Those were different things. Confidence was the absence of doubt. Calm was what you wore over doubt when the doubt was not useful. Vorith had been studying humans for 20 years. Most of her colleagues had never learned to read that distinction. "What exactly?" Movori Primary said, "Their segments rotating slightly faster, a sign of calculation or possibly agitation. It was hard to tell." "You propose to do?" "I don't know yet," Neka said. The room reacted. Several delegates shifted toward objection. "That is an honest answer," Neka continued, "and I think after 31 hours of failure, you deserve an honest answer more than a confident one. My team has looked at your cascade analysis. We agree with your diagnosis. Recursive deference loop, full depth core architecture. We disagree with your only proposed solution. The mathematics are definitive, said a Muvori technical assistant from the side of the room. The mathematics are definitive within your modeling framework, NECA said, not unkindly. I'm suggesting a different framework. Another silence, shorter this time. Resprime's resonance throat clicked softly. You have 47 hours. I know, NECA said. I'll need 6 of them just to read the architecture properly. She unfolded her arms. I'd like to start now. The access chamber was a small, cylindrical room at Vera Solemn's technical core, accessible only through 3 security checkpoints and a biological confirmation lock that had been designed to accommodate 18 different body types. NECA had to stand on a small platform to reach the confirmation surface, a fact she had always found quietly absurd. Her team consisted of 4 people. James Okafor, 29, systems theorist, originally from Lagos, who had the specific cognitive gift of being able to hold 12 interdependent logical states in working memory simultaneously and notice when one of them was lying. He sat cross-legged on the floor the moment they entered, laptop open, and started reading cascade logs with the focused stillness of someone defusing something very small and very dangerous. Dr. Linyu, 41, a specialist in what humans call legacy systems archaeology, the practice of understanding not just what old code does, but why it was written that way, what assumptions the original authors held, what they feared, what they thought was obvious. She had spent her career exhuming the logic of dead systems. She stood at the primary interface terminal and touched it the way a doctor touches a patient, lightly, feeling for something. Tomas Reyes, 36, originally from Guadalajara, a practical engineer with the philosophical conviction that every complex system, no matter how alien, had at least one load-bearing idea at its center, and that if you found the idea, you found the system. He carried a battered notebook, actual paper, an affectation his colleagues tolerated because his notes were invariably useful, and began sketching the cascade diagram from memory. And Vorthov the Seventh Deepening, who had followed them uninvited, and was now standing in the corner with her filaments in a configuration NECA recognized as I am here, because I cannot stand to be elsewhere. Nobody asked Vorth to leave. Talk me through the original design philosophy. NECA said, not at anyone in particular. Lynn answered without looking up from the terminal. 600 years ago, the Davari contributed the foundational coordination protocol. Their systems architecture is based on what you call a trust hierarchy. Every system confirms its own stability before reporting upward. It's elegant, it's stable. It's been the assembly standard for 3 millennia. And it works perfectly, James said, as long as the hierarchy is unambiguous. What happened to the hierarchy? 600 years of additions, Tomas said, his pen moving. 43 civilizations, each one adding their components in ways that were technically compliant with the protocol, but that shifted what counts as a higher or lower system. After enough additions, the hierarchy became... He paused, searching for word. Circular. Voris said from the corner. Everyone turned to look at her. I know, she said. Her filaments moved in the pattern for I have known for some time, and it has not helped. The loop is not a malfunction. It is the station's architecture achieving perfect consistency with itself. Every system is deferring correctly, according to the rules it was given. The problem is that the rules collectively form a closed ring. She paused. In Davari philosophy, we have a word, Vethorin, for a situation that has become more coherent than the reality it was meant to describe. The station has achieved Vethorin. It is running exactly as designed. The design has simply become untethered from the physical requirements of human habitation. Lynn had turned fully around now. How long have you known the loop was this deep? Vortha's filaments pressed flat. 19 years. There was a minor cascade event in the secondary water recycling systems. My analysis suggested it was an early symptom of architectural circular dependency. My report was reviewed by 4 senior technical guilds. A pause. They found the underlying system stable, and my concern premature. Tomas looked up from his notebook. They told you it was fine? They told me the mathematics showed no immediate failure risk. A longer pause. In hindsight, I believe they were correct. There was no immediate failure risk. The risk was approximately 600-year term. Her colors, a faint bioluminescent signal along her dorsal ridge, something NECA had learned to read as emotional register, shifted toward a pale, cold blue. I stopped raising concern. I had been reconsidering that decision for 19 years. The room absorbed that. James looked up from his laptop. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, so the loop is structurally perfect and classically unsolvable within the deference architecture. He tapped his pen against his knee. But here's what I want to know. What's the station actually doing while it waits? What do you mean? Lynn said slowly. What it's doing? A recursive deference loop means the systems are waiting, James said. They're not broken. They're paused. They're holding their last known stable state and waiting for a confirmation signal that isn't coming. He looked up. So what state are they holding? Vortha's filaments lifted, the Davari equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. The protocols do not consider that question relevant. The loop is defined by the absence of forward motion. The held state is simply. It's not simply anything, James said, not rudely, with focus. A system waiting for input is still a system. It has a posture. It has a last instruction. He was typing rapidly. Can you give me access to the loop's internal state memory? Not the cascade log. The actual waiting state of each frozen system. Vorth looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and entered her authorization into the terminal beside him. The display changed. What appeared was not a cascade failure map. It was something that looked, to NECA's eyes, more like a snapshot. Every system aboard the station captured mid-thought, paused at the exact moment it had been waiting to speak, and found no one listening. There, James said quietly. Lynn crossed the room and leaned over his shoulder. Then she was very quiet for almost 2 minutes. It's not waiting randomly, she said finally. No, James agreed. Each system froze at the end of its last meaningful task cycle. So it's not just holding a state. It's holding a completed state. It finished its job. Lynn straightened up. It finished its job and then waited to report that it had finished. And the report never went through. And then the next cycle started, and it couldn't begin the new cycle until it finished reporting. And it's been stuck at the boundary between done and beginning for the entire cascade duration, Tomas said, looking at the display from across the room. Yes. NECA looked at the display. She looked at the configuration of frozen systems. She looked at the pattern of where each system had stopped. Then she looked at Vorth. Your deference architecture, she said carefully. When a system finishes a task and wants to report upward, what does the report contain? What's the minimum information a completed task signal carries? Vortha's filaments moved slowly. 3 elements. System identity. Task completion confirmation. Current stability status. And the loop is blocking that signal from reaching the higher systems. Correct. So the higher systems don't know the lower systems are stable. NECA paused. But what do the lower systems know about themselves? A very long pause. They know, Vorth said very slowly, that they are stable. They completed their cycles. They know this. They are simply unable to communicate it. Right, NECA said. I don't understand what you're suggesting, said Res Prime, who had apparently followed them to the access chamber at some point and was standing in the doorway. I'm not suggesting anything yet, NECA said. Tomas, sketch me the reporting chain. Not the hierarchy. I mean the actual data packet that travels between systems when they communicate. What does it look like at the structural level? Tomas was already drawing. Here is what Tomas drew. Not a hierarchy. A ring, not a broken ring. That was the critical thing. A perfect, complete, unbroken ring of deference. System A waiting for System B. System B waiting for System C. System C, eventually, through 17 layers of dependency, waiting for System A. A beautiful problem, Lynn said, with a tone that the others recognized as genuine scientific appreciation operating in parallel with genuine dread. Every civilization in the assembly uses a deference model, Res Prime said from the doorway, his resonance voice carrying the frequency they'd all learned meant careful assertion. It is the most stable coordination architecture known to systems theory. It prevents rogue outputs. It ensures validated status propagation. It assumes a top, James said. Rest Prime paused. What? The deference model assumes there's a top of the hierarchy, a system that doesn't wait for anyone, an originating authority. James gestured at Tomas's sketch. 6 centuries of additions removed the top, not maliciously, not even carelessly. Just the thing that used to be at the top got reclassified, updated, rebuilt, and at some point the top became just another node in the ring. He looked up. The station has been running on accumulated momentum for approximately the last 40 years. Old cycles carrying forward, new cycles starting slightly delayed, the lag accumulating invisibly because the systems are good enough to compensate. He paused until a threshold was crossed, and the compensation wasn't enough anymore. So we need to reintroduce a top, Rest Prime said. That would take years, Lynn said. You'd have to rebuild the entire reporting architecture, re-identify which systems belong to which layer, rewrite the deference logic for every one of the 43 contribution types. Yes, said Rest Prime. That is what the evacuation scenario leads to. For years of... We don't have 4 years, NECA said. We have 43 hours. Silence. So, what do you do? Tomas said, mostly to himself, turning his notebook slowly. When the ring has no top, and you can't rebuild the ring, but the ring is full of systems that all know they're stable and just can't say so? He looked at the sketch. The ring, perfect, closed, every node waiting. You don't fix the ring, he said. Tomas, Lynn said. You don't fix the ring, he repeated. You don't add a top. You don't rebuild the hierarchy. Those all require changing what the systems are. He put his pen down. You change what they're listening for. The room was very quiet. Explain, NECA said. The loop is blocking vertical communication. Tomas said. System A can't report to System B because B is waiting for C, and C is waiting for A, and so on. The signal path is blocked because every signal is traveling up the hierarchy toward a top that doesn't exist. He tapped the sketch. But the systems aren't blocking horizontal communication. They're not even sending horizontal communication because the protocol never anticipated needing it. Why would a stable system broadcast its status sideways? It only needs a report up. James had stopped moving. You want to add a broadcast layer, he said. Not add, temporarily introduce. A single pulse, architecture external, that reaches every system simultaneously and carries a message that doesn't require a hierarchical response. Tomas looked up. Something that says, this is not a report. This is not a request for deference. This is a permission to proceed. That's not a concept that exists in the deference protocol. Vorath said carefully. No, Tomas agreed. It isn't. So the systems will not recognize it. Unless, Lynn said slowly, we encode it in something they do recognize, not as a coordination signal, as, she stopped, thought, as an environmental input. Vorath's entire dorsal ridge lit with a color NECA had never seen before. Explain environmental input, NECA said. Every system aboard the station, Lynn continued, her voice quickening, regardless of which civilization contributed it, regardless of what coordination protocol it runs on, has a common baseline input layer for physical environmental data. Temperature, pressure, electromagnetic field state, gravitational variance. Because every system needs to know whether it's physically inside a functioning station. She turned to Vorath. The environmental input layer, is it part of the deferent hierarchy? No, Vorath said. It is pre-hierarchical. It is the substrate the hierarchy is built on. So it's below the loop. It is below everything. And if we introduce a coordinated pulse through the environmental input layer, James said, working it through out loud, that carried a specific pattern, not a command, just a pattern, that each system's own baseline logic can interpret as external stability confirmed. You be telling every system simultaneously, Tomas said, not from above, not from another system in the ring, but from the floor beneath the ring, that the environment is stable, that the context they're waiting in is not a degraded state, that the reason no confirmation is coming is not because something is wrong. He paused. You'd be giving the ring an exterior. The room absorbed this. It might not work, Vorath said. I know, Tomas said. If the systems interpret the pulse as a genuine environmental event rather than a permission signal, if they calculate a discrepancy between the pulse and their actual sensor readings, the cascade could accelerate. We could lose 8 to 12 hours off our window. I know, Tomas said again. And if the environmental layer itself is caught in secondary aspect of the loop, which my original analysis suggested was approximately 30% probable, the pulse will not propagate. We would be back to evacuation scenarios with reduced time. 30%, James said. So 70% probability it propagates. That is not how probability works in a... Vorath, Neka said quietly. Vorath's filaments stilled. Is there a better option? A very long pause. No, Vorath said. Then we model it. Neka said, James, Lynn, I need the pulse architecture. I need to know what pattern we encode so it reads as environmental stability data and not a command signal. Tomas, can we test a partial pulse on an isolated system before we commit? I can isolate the tertiary water recycling system, Vorath said. It is the lowest dependency node in the ring. A partial pulse that would show propagation behavior without triggering cascade acceleration. A pause. If it goes wrong, we lose water recycling for the remaining window. It is already degraded. The loss is acceptable. Do it, Neka said. They worked for 9 hours. At the 4-hour mark, Neka stepped out of the access chamber for the first time, walked to the small observation window at the end of the corridor, and stood in front of the star field for 6 minutes. She ate something from a packet. She breathed. At the 5-hour mark, the test pulse on the tertiary water recycling system showed partial propagation. Not full, but directionally correct. The system had received the environmental signal, processed it, and shifted its waiting state by a detectable increment. Not enough to break the loop, but proof of concept, proof that the floor beneath the ring could carry a message. James celebrated this by immediately identifying 3 ways the partial result could mislead them. Lynn calculated pulse geometry for 4 more hours. The mathematics of encoding stability data in a format that felt environmental rather than directive required, it turned out, understanding not just the Davari coordination protocol, but the environmental baseline assumptions of all 43 contributing civilizations. Vorath sat beside her for those 4 hours and answered every question. At the end of them, Lynn said quietly, You know this architecture better than anyone. Yes, Vorath said. Your report 19 years ago. If they had taken it seriously, we would have had time to rebuild the hierarchy properly. The station would not be in this situation. Vorath's dorsal ridge dimmed to a very faint coal blue. I have calculated this. Lynn was quiet for a moment. That must be a heavy thing to carry. I stopped raising concern, Vorath said. That was my choice. I could have been more persistent. I have wondered for 19 years whether I did not persist because the mathematics genuinely seemed acceptable or because I was tired of being told I was premature. She paused. I still do not know the answer. I suspect I will not know after this, either, regardless of outcome. Lynn said nothing. She put her hand on Vorath's thorax, very gently, in the way she had seen Davari nestmates comfort each other. Vorath went very still. That's, Vorath began. I know it's not your custom, Lynn said. You can tell me to stop. Vorath's colors shifted. Not cold blue. Something warmer, deeper, without a direct human equivalent. No, Vorath said. Don't stop. At hour 9, they were ready. The pulse architecture was complete. It would propagate through the environmental baseline layer of every system simultaneously, carrying a pattern that encoded in the native logical language of each of the 43 technical traditions, a single concept. The ground beneath you is stable. You are not waiting in a broken place. The silence is not a warning. You may proceed. It was not a command. Commands move through the hierarchy. This moved below it. It was not a repair. The loop would still exist after the pulse. The ring would still be closed. What it was technically was a context correction. Every system in the loop had frozen not because of mechanical failure, but because it had interpreted the absence of confirmation as evidence of instability, evidence that proceeding would be dangerous. The pulse would correct that interpretation. It would not change what the systems were. It would change what they believed about where they were. The cascade simulations, rerun with the pulse architecture included, showed a 67% probability of full loop resolution within 4 minutes of pulse initiation, 18% probability of partial resolution, some systems breaking free, others requiring secondary pulses, 15% probability of failure. That's an 82% chance of at least partial success, James said. That's a 15% chance of accelerated failure, Rest Prime said. He had been in the room for the last 6 hours. He had not spoken much. He had watched with the focused attention of someone revising a long-held assessment. Yes, NECA said. If the pulse fails, we have approximately 31 hours remaining on the window. Evacuation would be possible, NECA said. Yes, evacuation would be possible. It would also end the Conclave Treaty framework, restart 3 border disputes, and signal to the Athrani cluster that this assembly cannot maintain its own infrastructure. She looked at him. You know what it means. You've known since yesterday. Resprime's resonance throat clicked through 3 frequencies she didn't have words for. I have also, he said finally, been reconsidering a long-held assessment. Of humans, of what it means that you think differently than we do. He paused. You looked at the loop and asked what the systems were doing while they waited. No assembly technical guild asked that question. It was not because we lacked intelligence. It was because the deference model, which we have used for 3,000 years, does not contain a conceptual space for that question. The model has no grammar for the interior experience of a waiting system. Another pause. You have different assumptions. Not better, but different in a way that allowed a question we could not form. NECA was quiet for a moment. That's the most honest thing anyone from the assembly has said to us in 30 years, she said. Yes, he said. I think it may be. She turned to her team. Tomas, initiate the pulse. For minutes is a strange unit of time when you are waiting to find out if 600 years of civilization survive. At 12 seconds, nothing happened. At 31 seconds, the environmental baseline layer activated across the station simultaneously. NECA could hear it as a faint vibration through the floor, almost below the threshold of perception, the kind of sound you feel in your sternum before your ears process it. At 44 seconds, the tertiary water recycling system, the one they had tested, broke free of the loop entirely. Its status signal, the one it had been trying to send for days, finally propagated upward. A single golden light on the cascade map shifted from red to green. James made a sound. At 1 minute, 8 seconds, 3 more systems resolved. Then 2 more. Then a cluster of 7 atmospheric processors that had been among the deepest in the cascade failure, all resolving within 4 seconds of each other, their status signals flooding upward through the newly cleared channels like water finding a sudden slope. At 1 minute, 41 seconds, the loop broke, not at one specific point. The ring didn't snap, it dissolved. Each system, receiving its environmental context correction, processed the new information, recalculated its waiting state, and concluded independently that proceeding was safe. The confirmations that the higher systems had been waiting for arrived not in hierarchy order, but all at once, a simultaneous cascade of complete signals flooding through architecture that hadn't carried active data in 31 hours. The cascade map, which had been a landscape of red and amber, went gold so quickly it looked like a sunrise. At 2 minutes, 14 seconds, Verisolem's atmospheric processors came fully online. The ventilation note, a subsonic hum that everyone aboard the station had been hearing without registering as sound for 6 centuries, returned. Nobody spoke for a very long time. The formal report to the Galactic Assembly was submitted 11 hours later. It used careful language. It described the pulse architecture in technical terms that could be understood by the engineering guilds of all 43 member civilizations. It credited Vorathov VII Deepening with the fundamental analysis of the loop structure and with providing the architectural knowledge that made the pulse encoding possible, language that NECA had insisted on, and that Vorath had argued against for 20 minutes before accepting. It recommended a full audit of Verisolem's coordination architecture, to be conducted by a joint technical commission over the following 2 years, with the goal of formally introducing a loop detection protocol and rebuilding a genuine hierarchical apex. It did not editorialize about what the crisis had demonstrated. NECA had considered it and decided that editorializing was the wrong instinct. The assembly delegates had been in the room. They had watched. They did not need her to explain what they had seen. What they had seen was not humans solving a problem that the assembly couldn't. What they had seen was a problem that required a question the assembly's existing frameworks couldn't form, and a species that happened to carry a different framework, not a superior one. Different, complementarily different. That was a harder thing to summarize in a report. It didn't fit in a single sentence. It resisted the kind of clean lesson that historical records preferred. NECA thought that was probably appropriate. Vorth found her at the observation window 2 hours after the report was submitted. The star field outside was unchanged. It always was. You could have claimed more credit, Vorth said. So could you, NECA said. Vorth's filaments moved in a pattern NECA had never seen before. She was fairly certain it wasn't in any of the cultural briefing materials. In Davari tradition, Vorth said, when two nest members solve a problem that neither could have solved alone, there is no word for who solved it. There is only a word for the solving, the act itself without attribution. A pause. Our languages have not always had the concept for what exists between us and your species. We have been building the vocabulary slowly. We have too, NECA said. Outside, Vera Solemn continued its long, slow orbit around the null point between 3 solar systems. Its systems reported upward. The hierarchy held. Somewhere in the station's environmental baseline layer, the faint ghost of the pulse still echoed. Not a signal anymore, not data, just a memory of frequency that told every frozen, waiting, perfectly functioning system aboard. The ground beneath you is stable. You may proceed. There is a document in the Assembly's historical archive, classified under the designation Informal Cultural Observation, First Tier, which means it was written by a sitting delegate, not intended for official record, and preserved by archivists who recognized it as something that deserved preservation. It was written by Res Prime, senior Threnish delegate to Galactic Assembly, 3 days after the Vera Solemn crisis. It was addressed to no one. It reads, in translation, approximately as follows. We have spent 30 years measuring the humans by the questions they could answer. We thought this was a reasonable metric. It is, in fact, a close ring. The value of a different mind is not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it is capable of forming. You cannot assess this in advance. You discover when your own questions have run out. I do not know what this means for the Assembly's approach to human membership. I expect it will be discussed for decades. I expect the discussion will be conducted primarily in frameworks that cannot fully contain what happened here. That is the nature of institutions. What I know personally is smaller, and perhaps more important, I was wrong about what 30 years of observation had taught me. I was wrong in a way that the 30 years could not have corrected, because the correction required an event outside the 30 years. This is uncomfortable to record. I am recording it anyway. Comfort has never been the purpose of accuracy. Kero, that is a Davari word for the moment when a new concept becomes necessary, not the concept itself, the moment before it. When you realize the language you have is no longer sufficient for the reality you are in. Vorth of the 7th Deepening experienced Kero 3 times in her life that she could identify with certainty. The first was when she was young and understood, for the first time, that her nest mother would die. The second was 19 years ago, when her cascade analysis showed a loop no one wanted to see. The third was in a small cylindrical access chamber, when a human woman put her hand on Vorth's thorax and asked nothing, offered nothing, only stayed. Ob SYMJHY. This is not a word from any assembly language. It is something NECA said to her team during the 9 hours of work, under her breath, in a moment she thought no one heard. It means, approximately, from this point, it is mine to carry. Vorth had asked her, later, what it meant. NECA had thought about it. It means, she said, that you stop waiting to be given permission to do the thing you already know needs doing. Vorth's filaments had moved in the pattern for yes, but also more than yes, in a direction I don't have a word for yet. That wordless direction, that space between species where the vocabulary was still being built, was the most alive place on Vera Solemn. It always had been. They simply hadn't, until now, had a reason to notice. And